A hooded person entered a tavern and was welcomed by a bald man. He moved through the crowd, where people were sitting, drinking, and chatting, before stopping beside a man seated at a table and asking for permission to speak. The man greeted him and addressed him as Werner. Werner questioned whether it was appropriate for someone like the hero to be there, while the hero responded that Werner himself was a viscount. Werner mentioned that he had already ordered the usual, and the hero stated that he knew he could rely on him. Werner then noted that it was good to see him return safely, and the two raised their drinks and finished them. The hero commented that he preferred this place compared to formal settings, while Werner replied that some things simply suited certain people better. He then reflected that the hero, Maisel, was his best friend. When they first met, he had wanted nothing to do with him, but life could take unexpected turns, and his presence in this world was proof of that. And he used to be an ordinary Japanese man, raised in a normal household and working a regular job, living as nothing more than a background character. And the world resembled a medieval European setting and recognized it as the world of a game he had once played. It was a typical RPG where the hero defeats the demon lord and saves the world. However, he noted that this only described the first half of the story. In the latter half, the demon lord's forces invade the capital and burn it to the ground. This event serves as the backdrop for the final stage, where the hero is crowned king. Werner pointed out that he lived directly in the area where this destruction would occur. In addition, he was an aristocrat who was never mentioned in the game, effectively a background character, which he believed likely meant his death would go unnoticed. He concluded that he did not want to die like that. Because of this, he pushed himself relentlessly, training his combat abilities to protect himself. As time passed, he eventually enrolled in the capital academy. A classmate approached and remarked that he always had his nose in a book. Werner responded that he was not necessarily being studious, but the classmate asked for help with something in political science, referring to him as the top student in class. Internally, he stated that he was not anything special. He considered himself a diligent spearman trying to save his own life, along with being a good student only in subjects that matched his previous life knowledge. The classmate then mentioned that there were girls who looked at him with interest. Werner considered this and suggested it was likely due to his father being a count. He then implied that if anyone was truly popular, it would be someone else. Nearby, several girls were gathered, chatting and laughing around Maisel. Werner observed this and acknowledged that Maisel Harting, the main character of the game, was originally just a commoner, yet he had entered the academy through a special scholarship thanks to his unique skill. Because of that, a lot of people had taken an interest in him. Werner noted that they were even in the same grade, which only reinforced one thing for him. Werner's suspicions were confirmed. With Maisel's enrollment, the world was already shifting toward the game's opening events. Because of that, Werner chose to stay in the background, deliberately acting like a non-player character so that everything could proceed as it should. He made a conscious effort to avoid getting involved with Maisel as much as possible. Meanwhile, a girl settled near Maisel, offering him sweets and encouraging him to try them, claiming they were a specialty from their country. Maisel accepted without much hesitation. From a distance, Werner observed the situation. He recalled that the girl leading the group was an exchange student from a neighboring country called Salzanak, and also the daughter of a duke. He noted that gatherings like these often happened in the academy cafeteria, usually serving as matchmaking events. Werner told himself girls like that held no appeal, but the strange potion she had quietly used was another matter entirely. He wanted to know what she was after. Werner pushed the thought aside. Maisel was the protagonist, the kind of person who didn't get taken down by something this crude, and certainly not before the story had even started. However, that assumption did not hold for long. The Duke's daughter suddenly noticed something was wrong and called out to Maisel, asking what had happened as his condition visibly worsened. His face had turned pale, and his body was no longer responding normally. Seeing this, he could not believe it. Maisel had actually eaten one. His first thought was the bodyguards. Where were they? But Maisel was the protagonist. Surely that counted for something. But that thought immediately wavered. There was no guarantee that events would follow the game exactly as he remembered. If something went wrong here, the consequences would be serious. Werner moved without hesitation. Maisel was the only one capable of defeating the demon lord. He grabbed Maisel's hand and checked his condition, confirming that his pulse and breathing were still stable. Based on that, he concluded that the academy's nurse should be able to handle the situation. The Duke's daughter, however, reacted immediately, stating that since Maisel had fallen ill after consuming something from her country, she would take responsibility and arrange for a proper doctor to examine him. Werner refused and pushed back. Moving Maisel by carriage in his current state was too risky, and the cause hadn't even been confirmed yet. He refused to put that weight on her regardless. The school nurse was the right call. Hearing this, the expressions of the Duke's daughter and the girls behind her noticeably changed. Werner could feel their hostility as they glared at the two of them. Ignoring that, he carried Maisel away, focusing only on securing the protagonist. From what he had seen, he suspected that the entire situation might have been a kidnapping attempt, though he had yet to decide how to handle it. Soon after, they arrived at the Academy's medical ward. There, Werner immediately confronted Maisel's bodyguards, questioning how they could leave him so exposed and arrive so late. He demanded to know what they had been thinking. The bodyguards tried to justify themselves, explaining that Maisel had been with an exchange student, specifically the daughter of a duke, and that they believed it was necessary to act diplomatically. Hearing that, Werner realized they had knowingly taken the risk and left him unattended. He considered their judgment completely foolish. Without wasting any more time, he gave them direct orders. He told one of them to report the incident to a teacher, and the other to keep a close watch on the young lady and her associates. The bodyguards hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Werner cut them off, his tone making it clear the question was not open for debate. The bodyguards immediately responded and left without further argument. Once they were gone, Werner drew the curtain and looked over at Maisel lying on the bed. Watching Maisel sleep there, Werner couldn't shake the thought. He should have stepped in before any of this had the chance to happen. The world was still at peace, which meant no one truly valued the hero yet, but that wouldn't last. If Maisel kept getting targeted like this, the events that were meant to follow the Demon Lord's revival could easily be thrown off course. He found himself wondering whether he needed to get more involved. Before he could reach a conclusion, Maisel suddenly woke up and asked where he was. Werner handed him a glass of water and told him that he had been poisoned. The antidote was already working, but things might still feel off for a while. He told him to drink and rest, and clarified that it had been mixed into the sweets he was given. However, Maisel pointed out that the girl had eaten them as well and questioned whether she was safe. He told him not to worry about her. She had swallowed an antidote before Maisel even arrived at the party. As for what would have happened without his intervention, Werner laid it out plainly. She would have had Maisel carried off to the embassy, and by morning he would have found himself in a situation with no clean way out, a forced marriage, an uproar over a commoner sharing a room with a duke's daughter, and no say in any of it. Aristocrats had no reservations about playing that kind of game. Maisel needed to be more careful. Maisel smiled and started laughing. Werner asked what was so amusing, and Maisel replied that it was nothing, simply pointing out that Werner was also an aristocrat despite what he had just said. Werner asked if Maisel knew who he was, and Maisel confirmed it. They were classmates, and he had always wanted the chance to speak with him. Seeing that he was still not in perfect condition, Werner told him to lie back down. Maisel agreed, and Werner noted that since he was already speaking normally, he had assumed it was just something that came with being the protagonist. Maisel questioned what he meant by that, but before the conversation could continue, the door suddenly burst open. A group of people entered, with one of them demanding to know who Werner thought he was and telling him to leave because they would be using the room. Werner was momentarily caught off guard but responded calmly, pointing out that there was a student resting inside and asking them to keep their voices down. The man reacted aggressively, questioning how someone like Werner, an underclassman, could speak to him that way. Werner read the situation instantly. The man had no interest in talking, he was there for a fight. That build didn't belong to any student. Either they had hired someone untraceable, or this was a loyal knight under orders. The goal was probably to take Maisel by force and bury the responsibility under some diplomatic claim afterward. As the man grabbed him, Werner acted first. He struck with his foot and drove the attacker down, knocking him to the ground. Protecting Maisel meant treating these men as intruders, and that meant fighting. The numbers and muscle were against him, but if he could hold out long enough for the noise to bring a teacher, that would be enough. However, from behind the curtain, Maisel struck one of the attackers who had been charging at Werner, bringing him down immediately. Without hesitation, he continued and overwhelmed the rest of them, defeating each one decisively in front of the others. Werner watched it happen and could only stare. An absolute masterpiece. This was what a hero looked like. After finishing, Maisel turned toward him and asked if he was hurt. Werner replied that he was fine, noting that Maisel had taken care of everything. Maisel brushed it off, hands a little numb, but nothing he couldn't handle. Werner looked at him and noted that this was his weakened condition even now. Internally, he admitted that the situation had almost turned dangerous, but things had worked out because Maisel stepped in at the right moment. He believed that once he reported everything to the teachers and handed Maisel over to them, he would be able to relax. At that moment, a voice interrupted them as a teacher arrived and demanded to know what had happened. Werner raised his hand, thinking the timing was perfect, and greeted him. The teacher immediately asked what had taken place. Werner promised the full story later, but flagged the immediate concern. The men on the floor were likely not students at all. Someone had sent them, he explained, though exactly why remained unclear. The teacher would need to get that out of them once they were conscious. The teacher turned to the bodyguards and told them to fetch the others immediately. They were gone in seconds. Werner let out a quiet breath. The old man could take it from here. Later, Maisel's bodyguards had taken responsibility for the incident and were dismissed from their positions. He himself was asked to their place, but he refused the offer outright. Afterward, life at the academy returned to normal. Werner was once again seen holding a book when Maisel approached him, asking for help with something. It was not something Werner had anticipated. Somehow Maisel had latched onto him entirely. Maisel wanted help understanding the etiquette for an upcoming ceremony. Werner could hardly say no, and after what had already happened, keeping things on track mattered more than his own comfort. So he went along with it. Before long, they found themselves spending more time together and going through various situations side by side. Over time, their relationship grew closer, and they became inseparable. Together, they experienced their school life in their own way. Eventually, the moment arrived when the events of the game truly began. The story moved forward with a demon stampede, followed by countless battles that they faced together. At one point, Werner grabbed Maisel by the collar and told him plainly that if the price of saving the world was Maisel himself, then Werner would sooner change the world. He then reflected that this would become the legend of a hero that would be told for generations, and alongside it, the story of his closest friend. In the classroom, the professor explained that a demon stampede was a massive outbreak of demons that occurred roughly once every 20 years. He added that the academy would be supporting the effort to suppress it. Werner felt it immediately. The game's first big moment had finally arrived, and now that it had, his nerves had well and truly set in. The professor continued, stating that if left unchecked, these stampedes could attack towns and villages and cause widespread destruction. However, if handled properly, they would not pose such a threat. Werner knew better. The Demon Lord's revival was going to push demon numbers and strength far beyond what anyone was prepared for. The capital's knights would be wiped out, the heir to the throne would fall, and the whole thing would descend into a bloodbath. The professor then gave further instructions. Students from noble families were to return to their homes in the capital and await orders, while those without rank would join support squads to assist with transport and treat the injured. Werner's mind was already running the numbers. Maisel would end up shielding the students, that much was predictable, but the front line knights were going to be decimated. Fighting alongside them meant Werner would likely die too. That couldn't happen. He needed manpower secured and a strategy ready before any of this kicked off. He was still lost in thought when Maisel's voice pulled him back. Werner blinked and asked what was going on. Maisel gave him a look. It was already break time, and Werner hadn't moved a muscle. Realizing how absorbed he had been, Werner stated that he was heading home. Maisel was surprised and reminded him that they had planned to visit a weapon shop together to look at daggers. Werner apologized and said he had preparations to make, manpower to secure, among other things. Maisel raised an eyebrow. That level of preparation for a demon stampede struck him as a bit much. Werner replied that there was no guarantee things would unfold as they normally did. Maisel took it in stride. If that was how it was, he would just stick with Werner the way he always did. Werner shut that down immediately. He wouldn't be there this time. Confused, Maisel questioned him, and Werner explained that because of his family's rank, they would be assigned to different groups. Maisel acknowledged this, though his reaction carried a slight change in tone. Werner clocked the shift in his tone but let it go, telling Maisel to keep doing what he did, stay sharp, and trust himself. At the same time, he reflected on what he already knew. In this battle, Maisel would defeat the demon orchestrating everything. His actions would earn him recognition, and he would be known as the hero who saved the world. Before leaving, Werner added one more thing. He told Maisel to carry as many potions as he could. Maisel responded casually, agreeing to it, and Werner added that in the best case, he would not even need to use them. At that moment, another classmate rushed over in a panic, asking what he should do. Werner told him to follow the teacher's instructions, but the student admitted that he had never experienced a real battle before and was afraid. Maisel stepped in and reassured him, pointing out that he was skilled with a bow and suggesting that he bring it along. He added that he would likely be assigned to the support squad as an escort. The student seemed relieved hearing that. Soon after, another student approached, asking for advice as well. Maisel assessed her abilities and suggested that, as a mage, she would likely assist with treating the injured. He also advised preparing protective equipment just in case. Watching this, Werner was surprised. There was no way Maisel had memorized everyone's abilities so easily. Werner shook his head. The man never ceased to amaze amaze him. This world ran on a skill system not unlike a video game, where people developed specific abilities. Werner had earned his spearmanship through years of brutal training. Maisel's skill, on the other hand, was simply heroism, a little on the nose, and his skill essentially allowed him to master any combat technique instantly. While Werner himself had spent years training in spearmanship, Maisel could simply observe it once and use it immediately. He recognized it as an overwhelming advantage, a skill that gave Maisel a clear edge. He understood that the demon stampede existed as an event meant to give Maisel real combat experience, allowing him to apply his abilities in an actual battle. Even so, Werner knew that while Maisel would grow stronger through this, he himself still had to find a way to survive on his own side. Before they split off, Werner reminded Maisel one more time about the recovery potions. Maisel waved him off. He knew. They bumped fists and went their separate ways. Back at the estate, Werner learned from the family butler Norbert that his father would not be there. He would be with the king instead. Werner's stomach dropped. His survival odds had just taken a serious hit. He had assumed that, as a count and a minister, his father would remain far from the battlefield. However, Norbert explained that Werner would instead be acting as a commander for the family's troops. Werner questioned how a student could be placed in such a role, but the butler clarified that the actual command would fall to Max Lyman, and that the family's participation was mostly for appearance. For a typical small-scale stampede, maybe, but Werner knew full well this was not going to be anything like typical. Without wasting time, Werner told Norbert to get Max, stock up supplies, and bring in more soldiers. The butler looked uncertain, but Werner wasn't second-guessing it. He had no idea how much of a difference it would make, but his life was on the line. Half measures weren't an option. Soon after, the army began to assemble. As the knights marched forward and a horn signaled their advance, Werner observed the scale of the force. There were around 4,200 foot soldiers, along with 200 mercenaries and 100 students assigned to support roles. He noted that most of them probably couldn't even imagine losing a battle at this scale, and honestly, for them, this turnout alone was already a lot. Nearby, Max Lyman commented that gathering such a large force for a demon stampede seemed excessive. Werner agreed internally, understanding that for experienced soldiers, a standard stampede was almost routine. As a member of a civil servant family, he was accustomed to participating with only a handful of people, usually no more than 5. Even assembling around 100 men already felt like a significant effort. From that perspective, this level of preparation would normally be considered overkill. Werner wished they carried more of a sense of danger about it. There was no getting through to them, so he settled for being glad they were cooperating at all. One of the platoon commanders remarked that the situation might be too uneventful for the royal grandson's first battle. Werner responded briefly, while thinking about the larger picture. The supreme commanders were the crown prince and his son, the royal grandson, both heirs to the throne, and in the game's original events, both of them died here. The knights wiped out alongside them, an absolute catastrophe. Werner had every intention of keeping his distance from that particular disaster. At that moment, Max suggested that Werner take the opportunity to greet Count Forst while he had the chance. Werner found the idea somewhat awkward and reflected that the Zerfeld family, to which he belonged, was primarily composed of civil servants, while the Frost family had a strong military background. Since their territories were adjacent and their economic interests differed, their relationship remained stable, maintained through cooperation in distribution. Even so, he decided to proceed. He instructed Max to accompany him and left one of the platoon leaders, Organ, in charge during his absence. Organ acknowledged the orders. They then arrived and were received by Count Bastian Timoforst, who greeted them formally. Werner and Max bowed, and Werner introduced himself, apologizing for the delay in doing so. The Count acknowledged Max first, stating that he trusted him to properly assist the minister's son. Max accepted the responsibility without hesitation. Werner clocked it immediately. Max got addressed by name while he himself was only referred to as the minister's son despite introducing himself. He concluded that he was being overlooked. From his perspective, it was not surprising, as warriors often looked down on civil servants, and he accepted that it was simply how things were. Max Lyman was the acting battle commander. Of course, the Count's attention went to him first. At that moment, Tyrone, the heir of the Fürst family, stepped forward and suggested that his father should take command of Werner's forces as well. Max responded carefully, stating that such an arrangement would not be appropriate. Werner understood what it really meant. Essentially, they did not consider him capable enough to lead. Even so, he recognized that from their perspective, it was not intended as an insult but as a generous gesture. Even so, the obvious difference in status between them made the whole thing uncomfortable. This was exactly why he had not wanted to come. As the conversation continued, continued. Tyrone looked away when a voice interrupted him. Herman Forst entered the tent and addressed her brother, stating that such an arrangement would not be possible. Tyrone agreed with her. The Count's second daughter, Herman, if he was remembering correctly. She weighed in, suggesting that since Werner was still a student, it would be best for him to stay behind their forces and not push himself too hard. Werner thanked her for her concern. The Count then added that he should not overexert himself and should retreat immediately if he found himself in danger. Their whole manner confirmed it. Taking him seriously had never been part of the plan. Werner wrapped it up, told them he should get back to his men, took the Count's parting words in stride, and got out. After they left, Herman addressed Tyrone again, expressing doubt about his earlier remark. Tyrone admitted that he was aware of it, drawing the attention of both her and the Count. The Count noted that Werner had a real reputation at the academy, not just a nobleman's son coasting by. Tyrone had heard the same, including that Werner was the sole member of his household with any genuine military capability. A shame, though, that it was limited to spearmanship. The sword was the true mark of a knight. Spearmanship was a starting point at best, something a junior knight might build from. He then raised a more serious point, questioning who would inherit the Zerfeld lands if Werner were to die in battle. Elsewhere, Werner returned to his camp where his troops were already lined up before him. He told them he'd be going over the strategy once more, then stopped. Their expressions gave something away. They asked if something had happened while he was at the Frost camp. A few of them jumped in, insisting everything was fine, that they'd win and come back covered in medals. Werner waved it off. Barkey, the second platoon commander, remarked that considering the troops had only been assembled the previous day, they were impressively disciplined. While Organ agreed, noting that they had gathered a strong group of trained men. Werner internally reviewed the structure of his forces. Each squad consisted of 5 men with one acting as the leader. There were 18 squads in total, divided into 3 platoons. In addition, he had a hunter unit under his direct command. The logic was straightforward. Get orders down to the hunter unit and the 3 platoon leaders, and the whole force would have them in short order. With that in mind, he gave a clear directive. He instructed his men not to stand out during the battle and to always act as a unit. He emphasized that they should never fight alone and must avoid engaging any demon by themselves. The soldiers showed visible unease, shifting slightly as they stood in formation. Werner addressed them calmly, stating that even if this was only a demon stampede, he had no intention of allowing unnecessary losses. He made it clear that his objective for the Count's forces in this battle was simple. There would be no sacrifices. At the same time, he admitted to himself that things would not go so perfectly. The battle against the demon forces would drag on while Maisel leveled up, right up until he defeated the one controlling them. Until that moment, survival was all that mattered. Elsewhere, Maisel was seen preparing for the battle with an unusually large number of recovery potions. The others around him reacted to it, some surprised, while Maisel simply laughed it off. One of his companions remarked that for someone so strong, he was being surprisingly cautious. Another added that if anything happened to them, they would be relying on him. Before the conversation could continue, someone nearby ordered them to stop talking and form up properly. Maisel thought back to what Werner had told him. He had brought as many potions as he could carry, just like asked. Werner always had a reason when he said things like that, even when it seemed excessive. He couldn't help wondering what Werner was up to right now. While Werner commanded his soldiers with a clear focus, stating that he wanted to keep casualties to a minimum. He instructed them to engage each demon in groups of 5 and never fight alone. Once a target was taken down, they were to immediately assist nearby teams and repeat the process. Organ and Barkey both expressed their reservations, finding it difficult to agree with his approach. Werner responded firmly. Demons did not fight one-on-one, and there was absolutely no merit in showing off chivalry against them. Despite his reasoning, some of the soldiers still looked dissatisfied. Werner didn't blame them for it. In a world that prized individual strength, a group-based approach probably felt like he was doubting their abilities. But that kind of thinking wouldn't hold up this time. He then added that this was the royal grandson's first battle, and there was no need for them to stand out unnecessarily. Hearing that, Organ acknowledged the point. Werner explained that they still did not know the full scale of the demon stampede. Since it was a large outbreak, enemies would continue appearing no matter how many were defeated, possibly lasting the entire day. Under those conditions, it would be impossible to keep fighting at full intensity the whole time. Barkey agreed, noting that even weaker enemies could wear them down through sheer numbers. If they became surrounded while exhausted, casualties would be unavoidable. Werner confirmed this and emphasized that their goal was to minimize losses while achieving sufficient results. He instructed them to conserve their strength so that, if necessary, they could provide support support to other noble forces. The soldiers acknowledged his orders. Organ then laughed and requested that his platoon be sent to assist the Forst family when the time came. Werner agreed, though another soldier immediately pointed out that Organ's real reason was that he was a skirt chaser. Organ spun around at that, and he and Baki were at each other's throats in seconds. Werner watched the two of them go at it and noted that the mood was already picking up. Max Lyman remarked that they had better start getting ready themselves. Putting an end to the chatter, Werner ordered everyone to return to their positions. As he did, he sensed the atmosphere growing tense, just as he had expected. Not long after, the battle began. A few hours later, waves of monsters started pouring in, clashing directly with the knights. Just as in the game's storyline, the knights fought fiercely at first, but those who stood out too much were quickly overwhelmed. The number of casualties continued to rise as disorder spread across the battlefield. Amidst the chaos, Werner's forces maintained their formation. Orders were shouted continuously, instructing soldiers to coordinate with nearby allies and to send the wounded to the rear for treatment. The troops responded and followed through, while others continued pressing forward and taking down enemies in sequence. Werner directed the retreating squads to support the front lines while regrouping, and his soldiers complied without hesitation. He noted that they were managing to maintain an organized structure even in the midst of combat, steadily moving the injured away from danger. His body was starting to find its rhythm. Every enemy taken down was replaced by another immediately. No time to think, no time to even clear the blood from his face. But his body kept moving on its own. All that grueling training was finally paying off. As the fighting intensified, he raised his voice and warned his men not to push too far forward. And stay vigilant. The knights immediately acknowledged his command. He was breathing heavily as the battle continued, but internally he felt some relief. Everyone was still following the plan. If they could just hold the front line until Maisel defeated the one controlling the demons, they would make it through. However, that stability did not last. Suddenly, several soldiers ran past him in panic. Werner immediately recognized what was happening. There were too many deserters. He considered what he could even do about it. His unit wasn't going to shift the tide of the entire battle either way. They had turned out well for a civil servant family, but in the grand scheme of things, they were a trifling force. The royal elite knights were positioned on the right, while the military forces of the Forst family held the left. Werner's unit had been placed in a position that kept them protected behind these stronger groups. But if either of them collapsed, his forces would be exposed and forced into a desperate fight for survival. As a commander, and simply for the sake of his own life, he could not let either of those forces fall to ruins. He could send reinforcements, but the Forst family had their pride as a military house. If the timing was wrong, his help would be turned down flat. At that moment, Max Lyman shouted an order, telling the soldiers to use the bodies of the fallen as shields. Werner called out to him and asked about the situation on his side. Max reported that their position was holding, but the forces of other noble families who had advanced too far were being pushed back. The demons were steadily surrounding their army, closing in from multiple directions, and the noble families who had already joined them had regrouped and were now unified under their forces. Werner acknowledged this, but then he heard a scream. A monster was devouring a knight. Werner immediately rushed forward, thrusting his spear and striking the creature down in a single motion. As the monster fell, he ordered his men to charge before turning to the fallen knight and asking if he was still able to move. The knight expressed his gratitude, and Werner identified him as a member of the Forst family's unit. The man confirmed it. Werner then asked about the rest of his group, but the knight admitted that he did not know, explaining that he had suddenly been left fighting for his life. Werner accepted the situation and ordered his men to treat the injured soldier immediately, and reflected on what he was seeing. It was not only poorly equipped soldiers struggling, even the knights were having difficulty holding their ground. He weighed it, send reinforcements now, or wait a little longer. He wasn't going to reduce the overall strength of his forces over something so flippant. Instead, he called for Baki and decided that regrouping was necessary while they still had enough men capable of fighting. He ordered that as soon as they were ready, they were to move toward the Forst forces on the right flank and provide support. On the battlefield, Count Bastagne was already in the thick of it, cutting down demons and bellowing at his men not to falter. But something was off. The demons were acting strange, and too many of his soldiers, knights and common troops alike, had been gripped by fear and were next to useless. He had his hands full just trying to stop his men from running. Looking around, he demanded to know the whereabouts of Tyrone and Herman. A nearby soldier reported that both had moved ahead to support the front lines and had not been seen since. Sweat ran down his face as he ordered his troops to avoid reckless engagements and regroup. Elsewhere, Herman was caught caught in the chaos of the battlefield. She could hear her father's voice in the distance but could not make out what he was saying. Realizing she had been separated from the others, she decided she needed to retreat. Before she could do so, she called out to Tyrone, who soon arrived and engaged the monsters alongside her. He confirmed that she was unharmed, and she acknowledged that he had saved her. However, they both understood they could not remain there. Tyrone insisted that they needed to return to their father and receive new orders, and she agreed. Even with their superior armor and ability, the best they could manage was avoiding fatal wounds. Around them, soldiers who couldn't keep pace were being swallowed up by monsters, their screams cutting through the noise of the battlefield. Gritting her teeth, she ordered the remaining soldiers to get behind her and gather the fallen as they moved forward. Some hesitated, but before they could act, more monsters began closing in. She told them to stick together, even as she asked herself the same question: how had it come to this? But she knew the answer didn't matter. If they stopped moving, this battlefield would be their grave. With no other option, she focused on cutting down as many enemies as possible while pushing forward. In the middle of the fight, a monster closed in until it was practically in her face. In that last instant, the only thing in her mind was her father. But before it could reach her, the creature was cut cleanly in half. A voice called out, telling her not to push herself too hard and to maintain her position. Surprised, she tried to identify who had intervened. Barkey asked if she was unharmed, addressing her as the daughter of the Count. She realized that reinforcements had arrived, though she did not recognize which force they belonged to. Turning to the one who had saved her, she expressed her thanks and asked for his identity. Barkey introduced himself properly, stating that he was from the Zerfeld unit and that he had been sent to assist under the orders of Lord Werner. Hermin couldn't believe it. Between the earlier strike and the follow-up support, it was clear their warrior house was struggling while a civil servant family had somehow gained the upper hand. She told him it had been impressive work and asked whether it was the minister's son behind it. Barkey confirmed everything had been done at Lord Werner's command. Hermin accepted this and shifted her focus. Barkey then informed her that the wounded noble units were regrouping behind their lines and suggested that the first forces should also withdraw temporarily. He requested that she advise her father to take advantage of the situation. Her father and brother would likely see accepting Zerfeld's help as a disgrace. But this was their chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, and she knew it. Deciding quickly, she thanked him and stated that she would speak to her father immediately. Meanwhile, on the Zerfeld side, reports began coming in. A soldier informed Werner that the first troops had joined them, and that the other noble forces who had regrouped were steadily returning to the battlefield. Werner acknowledged this, realizing that things had worked out, for now. Even in a battle this brutal, the only reason they hadn't completely fallen apart was that their enemies were small fries. If things ended here, the Order of Knights might still come out of it intact. However, that thought only led to another concern. In the original course of events, there had been no clear information about how the Knights fared before their destruction. That uncertainty made him uneasy. Then, suddenly, a voice rang out behind him, declaring victory. Werner turned and questioned it, but the report was quickly confirmed. The enemy was retreating. Some soldiers celebrated, believing that holding out for this long had paid off. Werner wasn't so sure. Had Maisel already beaten the one pulling the strings, the way he did in the game? But in the game, that didn't happen until after the Order of Knights was completely obliterated. Max then remarked that it was thanks to Werner's leadership that their unit had suffered so few casualties. He added that the only thing left was to issue the order to pursue the retreating enemy. Werner's unease only grew. This was nothing like the game's story. Max urged him again, stating that the enemy was withdrawing and that orders needed to be given quickly. Werner questioned whether they were truly retreating, rather than scattering in fleeing. Max confirmed that they were moving toward the forest. Werner immediately ordered him to assemble the troops. He instructed that the injured be given potions from the rear supply unit and prepared for what was to come. Max began to question the urgency, pointing out that the enemy was already pulling back, but Werner cut him off and insisted there was no time. He stated that he was heading to the main army himself. Max acknowledged the order without further delay. Werner ran. The path was choked with bodies and scattered wreckage. Every step was a gamble. The stench of blood and intestines hung thick in the air, and just staying upright was taking everything out of him. He wasn't even sure he was sprinting at full speed anymore, but he couldn't stop. He was the only one who knew what horror was still coming. As he approached the central command, guards blocked his path. He demanded to be let through, stating that he had urgent information to report to the Crown Prince. The guards refused, telling him to relay his message through the chain of command. Going through the chain of command would take too long. If he wasted any more time here, it would all be for nothing. He had to get to the Crown Prince directly. Inside the camp, the atmosphere was completely different. Nobles were already celebrating, praising the knights for defeating the enemy's leader. Some expressed relief, believing the danger had passed, while others claimed that all that remained was to eliminate the remaining weaker enemies. Werner heard it all. They thought they had already won. At that moment, the royal grandson asked for permission to pursue the retreating enemy. The Crown Prince agreed. Werner stepped forward and raised his voice, calling out to the Crown Prince and stating that he had something urgent to report. The guards reacted immediately, questioning how he dared to address the Crown Prince directly and moved to remove him. The Crown Prince stopped them. The left flank had taken the worst of it, and someone coming from there with an urgent report deserved to be heard. Werner approached and knelt before him, introducing himself as Werner von Zerfeld of the Count's household. The Crown Prince acknowledged him, young, he noted, but clearly quite brilliant, and told him to proceed. Werner did not hesitate. He stated that the troops needed to retreat. His words immediately caused unrest among those present. He understood their reaction. They had just secured what they believed was a hard-earned victory, and he was now telling them to withdraw. From behind, one of the nobles questioned him, asking what he meant. The Crown Prince then asked him directly what led him to that conclusion. Werner, sweating, told them the enemy's behavior was abnormal. Before he could continue, a knight interrupted, stating that the demon believed to be their leader had already been defeated by the knights. He added that there was nothing unusual about the enemy retreating under those circumstances. Werner immediately rejected that interpretation. He clarified that the enemy was not retreating or fleeing in panic. Instead, they were withdrawing in an organized manner. Every type of demon was moving together, even those that should not possess any intelligence. From this, he reached a clear conclusion. They were not afraid. This was a deliberate trap meant to lure the knights into the forest. He explained that the enemy's main forces consisted of creatures such as insects and beasts, which had a natural advantage when moving within that terrain, and concluded that if they pursued the enemy into the forest, they would be at a severe disadvantage due to their heavy armor. Hearing this, the Crown Prince immediately issued an order for retreat. He commanded the knights to fall back and regroup with the remaining personnel. Some reacted in confusion, but he urged them to act quickly, and they obeyed without further resistance. Once the order was given, the Crown Prince turned back to Werner and asked if there was anything else. Werner made another suggestion. He proposed that the royal grandson should be assigned to guard the capital's gates. The Crown Prince considered this briefly before issuing another command. He ordered his son to move with the injured soldiers and the supply unit to the northern gate and take up a defensive position there. Werner understood the logic. At his age, the royal grandson was not someone you could count on for fighting strength. This gave him a reason to fall back to the capital with his dignity intact, and it saved them from having to spare soldiers to protect him. The Crown Prince then asked if Werner had anything more to add. Werner confirmed that he did not. With that settled, the Crown Prince instructed him to return to his camp and prepare to merge his forces with the Central Army. He added that Werner's role was not yet over and that further orders would follow once deployment was complete. Werner accepted the command. Soon after, Max arrived with the left flank forces and asked how things had gone. Werner told him he had managed to warn the Crown Prince before anyone walked into the enemy's trap. Once the knights regrouped, they would be launching a full assault, and he had been ordered to merge with the central forces. Max's reaction was immediate, a direct order from the Crown Prince himself. That was something worth celebrating, he said. Werner told him this was by no means a joyous occasion. Max pushed back. It was a huge honor regardless. At that moment, a soldier approached and informed him that Hermann had come to see him. Werner turned to face her as she approached and apologized for the sudden interruption. She explained that she needed to speak with him urgently. Werner informed her that they would soon receive further instructions and that, under the Crown Prince's orders, they were to relocate to the central position in preparation for the next phase of the battle. Hermann was surprised and asked for clarification. Werner explained that the enemy's withdrawal was a trap. She couldn't believe it, but if he said so, she trusted it. And if the withdrawal really was a trap, then coming to him had been exactly the right call. Before continuing, she formally apologized for her earlier behavior and thanked him for his assistance, stating that without his intervention, she would not have survived. Werner was left a bit speechless. However, Hermann continued and made a direct request. If the battle was to proceed further, she wanted his advice on strategy for the left flank, including the royal family's unit. Werner understood from her tone that she was serious. He felt that refusing her would not be appropriate, so he agreed. Later, after moving to the central area near the main camp, Werner admitted that simply getting there had been exhausting. Max told him to rest until orders came, then added that not only the first but several others had sought his advice on the way over. It made him feel cocky by proxy, he admitted. Werner clarified that it was not so much the first family as it was Herman herself who had taken the initiative. Max responded by calling him modest, adding that all of his advice had been precise, but remarked that he had not expected Werner to be such a capable strategist. Werner reflected on that, admitting to himself that everything he had done was based on knowledge carried over from his past life. Because of that, he was unsure whether he truly deserved the praise he was receiving. At that moment, a knight approached and delivered an order from the Crown Prince. Werner von Zerfeld was being granted authority to command the troops. He was to lead the various noble family units and take position on the right flank of the main force in preparation for the next enemy assault. The announcement left his group momentarily stunned. Despite that, Werner accepted the order. Internally, he realized that he would not only be fighting on the front lines but also commanding multiple aristocratic forces at once. His subordinates immediately began congratulating him, praising the recognition he had received. Werner couldn't help it. What was the Crown Prince thinking? He was still just a student. This was his first battle. Max stepped in. He could understand if Werner was nervous, but he wanted him to see it clearly. Everyone else had taken the demon stampede lightly. Werner alone had read the tide of battle and dealt with it accordingly. Barkey added that Werner had accurately read the flow of battle and taken the right actions, while Organ supported that view, encouraging him to continue as he had been doing so far. The Zerfeld troops declared that they would fully support his commands. Werner realized that it was not nervousness he was feeling. His men and Lady Herman were simply giving him far too much credit. In truth, he had only acted the way he did because he already knew the outcome. Everything else had been reverse calculation. The strategies themselves were nothing more than knowledge he had picked up from books. There was no certainty that any of it would actually hold up in real combat. To him, it felt like far too much responsibility to place on a single person. To steady himself, he struck his own face. His party immediately turned toward him, and he acknowledged them, agreeing with their support and thanking them. At the same time, he could feel the exhaustion catching up to him. He decided to push it aside for now. Everything else could wait until he survived. For the moment, he only needed to endure a little longer, until Maisel defeated the one controlling the demons. Clenching his fist, he refocused and turned his attention back to the battlefield. He needed to quickly organize a formation for his troops and prepare for what was coming next. Elsewhere, Maisel stood atop a defeated demon as one of his companions admitted that he had expected a student to slow them down, but had been proven wrong. Maisel accepted the remark with thanks. Lugenz pointed out that the large number of recovery potions Maisel had brought had been reassuring during the fight. Maisel admitted that they had used more than he initially expected, which led another companion to ask why he had brought so many in the first place. He explained that it was because Werner had told him to. He described Werner as someone intelligent who always looked out for him. Maisel added that he had been nervous when he was first assigned to the group, but Werner had advised him to continue as usual, stay alert, and he would be fine. One of his teammates questioned whether his noble friend was involved in the demon stampede, and he confirmed that he was, noting that it was expected given his aristocratic background. Another member asked if he was truly friends with a noble, and he confirmed it, explaining that the man did not behave in an arrogant or condescending way. A girl in the group commented on how troubling the situation sounded, mentioning that she had heard the main forces were struggling. Maisel glanced back and reassured them that they would be fine, explaining that his friend was always thoroughly prepared and highly skilled with a spear. He added that the man remained unusually calm, as he always thought before taking action. Hearing this, she acknowledged the explanation, while Lugenz urged them to quickly locate the enemy commander, both for their own sake and for the sake of Maisel's friend. In response, he simply stated that he would do his best. However, in the middle of their movement, he suddenly noticed something off and immediately warned his teammates to get down. Reacting without hesitation, he raised his sword and blocked an incoming attack. The sudden strike startled the others, and one of them asked what had just happened, while Lugenz quickly realized the situation, remarking that they had likely found what they were looking for. As Maisel focused his gaze ahead, the presence before them revealed itself. The creature spoke, acknowledging that the humans had arrived. It was clearly a demon. At the same time, Werner was already preparing for what he believed would be the next phase of the battle. He concluded that the following wave would likely escalate into a full-scale assault and immediately asked the nearby soldiers for an update on the situation. They reported that the unit assigned under his command had already received orders from His Highness the Crown Prince and was currently on the move. The Crown Prince had approved Werner's proposed strategy and troop formation, operation, and the forces were expected to arrive shortly. He acknowledged the report and expressed his thanks. The soldiers continued, explaining that other units had already begun retreating from the most dangerous areas. The wounded were being escorted back to the capital alongside Prince Reuven, and those unable to continue fighting had been instructed to follow them. Hearing the name, Werner placed it, that was the royal grandson. The report went on to state that their current position involved a controlled retreat while reorganizing their forces around the crown prince and the remaining soldiers who still had the strength to fight. Max expressed his gratitude, stating that thanks to Werner's actions, they had avoided being completely overrun. He admitted that he could not properly put into words how thankful he was for his presence. Werner responded calmly, remarking that the real challenge was only just beginning. As he assessed the battlefield, he reflected on how he had moved to the right flank of the main unit, where the crown prince had been efficiently coordinating operations. Now that their initial trap had failed, he was certain that the enemy's next move would be an all-out assault. Even as preparations for a large-scale retreat were underway, the prince showed no intention of abandoning the main camp. Werner took note of it. A commander holding his ground rather than pulling back from his own men was not something he could dismiss. However, his thoughts were interrupted when a soldier called out to him. Turning his attention, he was informed that Rheinish's unit had successfully reorganized. In addition, the forces led by Lady de Genkolb and Sir Oliver Goek had completed their deployment and had properly established their chain of command. He acknowledged their efforts, but his attention was immediately drawn to the individuals standing before him. As he observed them, the arrangement made no sense to him. Elite soldiers handed to a student. Whatever the crown prince had in mind, Werner could not read it. Max clarified the situation, stating that Werner had officially been appointed as their commander by the crown prince himself. Hearing this, he introduced himself as Werner von Zerfeld, representing his noble house. As he did, he reflected on the situation, realizing that both Lady de Genkolb and the others present were nobles as well. While they held titles, the difference in their status was not as significant as it might have seemed at first glance, especially considering his own family's standing. But Rheinisch addressed him, remarking that despite it being his first military campaign, he had calmly assessed the enemy's movements, calling it impressive. Hearing that, Werner thought that the man clearly had far more experience than he did. He responded by saying that precisely because it was his first campaign, his prior preparations had paid off. The man commented on his humility, but internally, Werner remained cautious. He considered that while they spoke politely, they were following orders from the crown prince and had little choice but to obey. Despite their courteous words, he could not be certain of their true thoughts, though he also admitted to himself that there was no real reason to expect betrayal in the middle of a battlefield. De Genkolb brought up what she had learned on the way over, that soldiers who had been under Werner's counsel spoke highly of him. She said that this was why they were pleased to serve under his command, then turned to Sir Oliver Goek for confirmation. Oliver confirmed it, noting that the judgment shown on the front line in particular had stood out to him. Being a mercenary, he added, meant that orders came first, and he intended to see them through completely. The others confirmed that they were all aligned, addressing him with acknowledgement. Werner found Oliver straightforward, a mercenary by trade, temporary commander of the adventurer and mercenary units, and someone who kept his complaints to himself. The other two were a different matter. His uncertainty about them refused to settle. Even so, he chose to accept their words at face value. He thanked them and made clear that falling short of the crown prince's expectations was not something he intended to allow. Then he moved the conversation forward. There was a battle situation to lay out and a strategy to lock in. Meanwhile, on the left flank, the forces of the Florist family were organizing their formation. Orders were being shouted as shields were assembled, with knights directing smaller and larger units into position. A meeting was taking place between the Count, his family members, and the knights under his command. The Count began by stating that they would review their movements as a unified force. He explained that, according to the Crown Prince's message, the enemy's numbers had increased and regrouped. It seemed they had realized that the army would not charge into the forest and had turned back instead. More intelligent forest goblins had gathered, consolidating their strength. He noted that while the enemy held a slight advantage in raw strength, it was not something that could not be overcome. In fact, they appeared somewhat intimidated by the attacks from the magic division. Because of this, he instructed the troops to fight in a way that would further damage the enemy's morale. Although the enemy outnumbered them, their movements as a unit would follow a specific plan. The 1st and 2nd Knight Brigades, who were currently retreating while engaging the enemy, would split toward the left and right. With the enemy's forest-facing side exposed, the main left and right flank units would launch a counterattack. Their objective was to agitate the enemy, disrupt their coordination, and gradually force them into retreat. retreat. However, one of the men raised a concern, pointing out that the distance between the main force and the capital was less than an hour on horseback. With so many uncertainties, allowing the demons to get any closer would be disastrous. Another agreed, adding that if the battle turned into a prolonged war of attrition, their lack of preparation would put them at a serious disadvantage. The Count stated that their priority was to buy time for proper preparation while weakening the demons' will to fight, all without reducing their own strength. Tyrone made his position clear. While he had no quarrel with the Crown Prince's overall tactic, he refused to accept a plan drawn up by someone as young as Werner, and one he considered to lack chivalry at that. Hermann immediately reacted to that remark, but the Count cut in, reminding Tyrone that they had already discussed this. He pointed out that Marquis Norpith, the commander of the left flank, had already approved the plan. Tyrone still protested, but the others added that Werner's strategy was innovative. The Count then turned to Hermann and instructed her to head out and reinforce Marquis Norpith's forces. She accepted the order without hesitation. Tyrone continued to argue, insisting that if the decision had been left to him alone, the Marquis would never have approved such a plan. In response, the Count acknowledged his concerns but firmly stated that Werner's strategy was the most logical under the current circumstances. He explained that a knight's worth was measured by achievements, but as nobles, they also had to consider casualties, including those of their slave soldiers. Tyrone tried to push back, but the Count was not finished. The current threat was nothing but small fries. The real danger was whatever might still be waiting to emerge. Defeating what appeared to be the enemy ringleader meant nothing if someone else was still orchestrating everything from the shadows. He added that with the search apparently still continuing, the situation was already abnormal, and there was no telling whether an ill-equipped search party could handle whatever came next. If matters escalated, they would not be dealing with minor enemies anymore. The others understood immediately, realizing that such a situation would fall to them to handle. The Count concluded by saying that it would be best if it did not come to that. Meanwhile, on Werner's side, the knights had finally begun moving into position. Seeing the knights finally on the move, Werner decided it was time. He gave the order to advance, and the soldiers charged toward the goblins. As the battle unfolded, he noted that the basic combat patterns remained the same. To ensure stability, he had reassigned the knights from the Count's faction under a new command structure. Although everything had been arranged at the last moment, he had established a network of messengers to relay instructions between captains. If they maintained this coordination, he believed the plan might succeed. At the right moment, he ordered a retreat, prompting the soldiers to pull back. Immediately after, he commanded the mages to attack, and flames engulfed the pursuing goblins. Observing the result, he noted that the strategy was working. Even so, he could not help but reflect on how mysterious magic still felt to him, as its effects appeared and vanished almost instantly. One of the soldiers pointed out that the enemy had fallen into panic, crediting Werner's orders for the result. He corrected them, making clear that the orders they had been following came from the Crown Prince. Privately, he acknowledged that this was not simple humility. He could not allow others to realize that he already knew how events would unfold. Even so, he found himself impressed by how much they had managed to accomplish in such a short time, attributing much of that to the Crown Prince's leadership. At that moment, a knight approached him and introduced himself as Wachtel from the 2nd Knight Brigade. Werner returned the introduction, stating his name, prompting him to ask what was on his mind. The knight explained that he wanted to discuss the actions of the right flank and asked about the main unit's orders. After striking the enemy, they were expected to coordinate with the right flank to push them back further. Werner understood that this meant working in tandem with the other forces. He paused to think, then asked about the current condition of the 2nd Knight Brigade. The knight reported that casualties had been increasing, but they were still holding their ground for the time being. Hearing that, Werner recognized the composure of an experienced soldier. In truth, he found himself wanting to rely more on the strength of the main force's knights. He concluded that they needed to return to the main camp, where their forces were currently outnumbered, in order to protect the Crown Prince. Because of the earlier operation, the 1st and 2nd Knight Brigades had been split apart and pushed to opposite ends. Taking that into account, Werner gave his decision, instructing them to join the right flank and move toward the main unit to reinforce its defenses. He then added that he himself would head toward the center to assist the Crown Prince. The knight in front of him reacted immediately, his expression tightening as he began to tremble slightly. He asked whether someone from a count's family was really willing to push himself that far. Werner could not read the reaction at all. The man looked furious, but whether that was actually anger or something else entirely, he had no idea. He ran through the possibilities. Was the knight taking issue with him risking his own troops for the Crown Prince's sake? Or did the man simply believe believe that protecting the crown prince was a knight's duty and his alone, something he had spent his whole career preparing for. Trying to interpret the situation, he reasoned that the knight's men were likely exhausted, and that perhaps the suggestion was to exchange positions. However, he quickly dismissed that idea, recognizing that he had no clear understanding of the situation on the left flank. If they were struggling heavily, it would be difficult for them to reposition. At the same time, his current unit was already positioned closest to the main force, making them the most suitable to move without delay. He acknowledged aloud how difficult the situation must be for them. Privately, he had no interest in doing something this dangerous, but the math was simple. If the crown prince fell here, the army would fracture, and the demon forces would pour through what remained. With that in mind, he stated that no unit was currently in a position to take on such a role alone, meaning that each of them had to do what they could. As a final remark, he added that in the worst-case scenario, they would simply have to push through. Hearing this, the knight suddenly bowed deeply, addressing him with respect and expressing his admiration for his resolve. Werner was caught off guard by the reaction, unsure how to respond as the man declared that they would hold the right flank at all costs. As the knight straightened, he praised Werner further, stating that despite his youth, he carried himself with remarkable integrity, and that his presence served as an inspiration. With that, he quickly departed to carry out his duties. Not long after, Max rushed toward Werner, calling out to him in concern and asking what had happened. Werner brushed it aside and noted that the timing was actually perfect. He then informed him that the Zerfeld unit would be moving to support the center at the main camp. Max took 1 second to process it, then concluded that they were being put forward as a shield for the crown prince. Werner reacted with slight confusion, but Max continued, explaining that he had just witnessed a knight from the brigade expressing deep admiration toward him. He went on to praise Werner, saying that not only was he an exceptional strategist, but he also showed unwavering loyalty, especially for someone of his age. Hearing this, Werner finally realized the misunderstanding. From their perspective, his actions appeared as though he was willingly placing himself in harm's way to protect the crown prince. In truth, he knew that their goal was simply to buy time until Maisel could defeat the final enemy. If the situation turned unfavorable, his instinct had always been to retreat. It had never occurred to him that others might interpret his decisions as self-sacrificial. Max, clearly moved, said something about when Werner had become such a fine young man, then pledged to give everything he had in his service. Werner, still unable to untangle the misunderstanding, let it go and told him they would push through together. Pushing those thoughts aside, he refocused on the battle and issued his next command. He ordered the troops to advance once more, break through the enemy's front line, and maintain that momentum while providing cover for the crown prince. Meanwhile, at the location where Maisel's group was searching, the battle against the enemy had taken a troubling turn. Lugenz pointed out that the creature they were fighting continued to regenerate no matter how many times it was struck. While Anna, visibly shaken, questioned what they were supposed to do, noting that no one had warned them they would be facing demons in this mission. Lugenz asked how Maisel was holding up, and he replied that he was fine. Lugenz suggested that if he could land a solid strike on the creature's main body, it might make some progress. However, the mage pointed out that even when they managed to hit it directly, it regenerated almost instantly. Lugenz brushed the concern aside entirely, telling the others not to worry their pretty little faces and to go on home. He had it covered. Anna immediately called him out for acting like such a big shot, insisting it was not as simple as he was making it sound. Even so, she admitted that thanks to someone's friend, they were well stocked with recovery potions. As the fight continued, Maisel kept cutting through the demon, observing how his teammates were gradually wearing down. He noted to himself that with the help of the potions, they could at least stay on their feet. However, he also understood that they needed to end the fight quickly. At that moment, another monster came at him from behind. He turned and cut it down without breaking his stride. Still moving, he turned his thoughts inward. He needed to wrap this up somehow, but he was not clever like Werner and had no complex strategy to fall back on. He reminded himself not to rush, deciding instead to focus on acting naturally and staying aware of everything happening around him. In his mind, he acknowledged that he was just an average person doing his best to keep up, carefully observing the situation and trying to figure things out step by step. As he fought, a past conversation surfaced in his mind, Werner telling him he had a wicked good memory and that he was better at certain things than Werner himself. Holding on to that thought, Maisel forced himself to focus, telling himself to observe carefully and think. Then, as he studied the enemy's movements more closely, he suddenly noticed something. Realizing he might have found a solution, he called out to Lugenz and the rest of the group, telling them he had a plan. Back on the battlefield, Commanders de Genkolb asks if Werner intended to move and assist the Crown Prince. Another confirmed it. Werner had spoken with a member of the 2nd Night Brigade and was now calling on them to push forward, collapse the enemy's formation entirely, and drive toward the front of the main unit. Hearing this, Lady de Genkolb took a moment to think before acknowledging the plan. She then turned to Sir Baki and stated that Werner would one day become a central pillar of the kingdom. He agreed, saying that if that came to pass, the country would surely prosper. Commander Reinisch noted that the details were clear. He pointed out that Werner had already demonstrated significant military ability by seeing through the enemy's trap, and now he was even offering to place himself in danger for the sake of the Crown Prince. Oliver added that, given the situation, it would indeed be unwise for the more distant 2nd Night Brigade to attempt to reposition to the front lines. The others continued to praise him, remarking on how remarkable it was for someone so young. Reinisch even reflected on his own youth, admitting that compared to Werner, he felt ashamed of himself. However, not everyone was comfortable with the idea. One of them pointed out that the front lines were extremely dangerous and questioned whether Lord Reinisch needed to be placed in such direct danger. In response, he firmly declared that being entrusted with the protection of the Crown Prince was an honor, and there was no greater duty than that. The sentiment spread quickly. Organ spoke up, saying they had been handed the chance to swing their blades freely for the Crown Prince, and for that, he could not thank Werner enough. Meanwhile, Werner was already on the battlefield, cutting through demons as the unit advanced. The sheer number of them was staggering. Even grinding to max level in the game had never been enough to wipe them out completely, so where were they all coming from? A knight approached and reported that messages had been successfully delivered to all units. He acknowledged this and immediately issued his next command, ordering the soldiers to advance 3 steps forward. Following his instruction, the troops pushed ahead and struck down the enemies in front of them. After making contact, he shouted the order to pull back and get word to the main unit. The soldiers turned and ran. His voice was already shot, no surprise there. Even so, he knew that all they had to do now was maintain their defense while moving toward the front of the main force where the Crown Prince was stationed. He also noted that the 2nd Night Brigade would join them, leaving the right flank they had previously occupied to fend for itself. All he could do now was hope the left flank held. He was about to be fighting front and center. On the left side, the Fürst family's unit stood firm, raising their shields as the knights braced themselves. They pushed back against the enemy, breaking through their ranks with coordinated movements. Watching this, Marcus Norpeth, the commander of the left flank, remarked on how effective the strategy was. He acknowledged that it was a sensible approach, fitting for a renowned military family like the Fürst household, and noted that their reputation was well deserved. However, Hermann corrected him, stating that the strategy had not originated from the Fürst family, but from Werner of the Zerfeld house. Surprised, the Marquis questioned whether she was certain, asking if it had truly come from someone so young. She confirmed without hesitation, explaining that before he moved toward the main unit, he had personally briefed her on the plan. He had instructed them to form a solid wall of shields to halt the enemy's advance, then strike through any openings that appeared. He had also emphasized that if the shield formation collapsed, the entire battle line would fall apart, which was why the bravest soldiers had to be placed at the front. Additionally, he had advised using the fallen enemies themselves as a means to support their gradual retreat. Marcus looked at her and admitted that it appeared Werner was even greater than he had thought. A knight standing behind him pointed out that this meant he was acknowledging Werner's excellence. Marcus resolved that this had to be reported to the Crown Prince directly. At the center of the battlefield, the Imperial Guard units under the Crown Prince's command were holding their ground. They shouted orders to maintain formation and push through the advancing demon horde, while soldiers responded and continued fighting. Amidst the chaos, the Zerfeld unit arrived to reinforce them. The order to retreat was called, and Werner immediately surged to the front. His soldiers followed, shouting as they advanced and struck the enemy. From the perspective of the surrounding units, everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. They acknowledged that once they secured some breathing room, they would fortify the Crown Prince's position. As they gradually pulled back, some of the knights began looking around, trying to identify Werner among the fighters. One guessed that he was the slender figure wielding a spear, while another remarked that he looked like someone fresh out of school. They also noted that he came from a civil servant family. No wonder the Crown Prince could not seem to do without him. Despite their observations, they agreed that he would have to prove himself through continued effort in the future. Meanwhile, Werner kept cutting through the enemy. One of his soldiers came up to report that every unit had finished moving and the fighting was fully underway across the board. Acknowledging the update, he called out to Max and told him that he would step back temporarily to focus on issuing commands, asking him to hold the front line in his place. Max accepted without hesitation and surged forward. Watching him, Werner Werner noted his overwhelming energy, though he wondered if it might even be excessive. Casualties were mounting. Without those potions, he was certain half of them, himself included, would already be on the ground. At this point, his priorities shifted toward managing a proper withdrawal, ensuring the wounded were recovered, and reorganizing the chain of command according to the current state of the troops. He realized that simply fighting on the front lines was difficult enough, but commanding an entire force was far more demanding than he had anticipated. Deep down he knew that becoming a capable commander was something he still had to earn, and right now, the weight of it was hitting hard. Then there were the Imperial Guards at the rear. Having them at his back lifted spirits, sure, but it also sealed off any path of escape. Without them there, he was fairly certain he would have already bolted. Even so, everyone on the battlefield was giving their all, and thanks to that, they had managed to secure the front line. Refocusing, he issued another order, instructing signal to be sent to the hunters, deciding that it was time to deploy their prepared tactic, and ready the slingshots, and told the rest to be prepared to fall back and set up for a counterattack. Until then, they kept working. As the signal was raised, the hunters moved into position and launched their projectiles. The shots struck the battlefield, igniting upon impact and engulfing the demons in flames. Observing the result, Werner noted that the plan was working. Unlike magic, which disappeared immediately after dealing damage, these improvised incendiaries continued to burn, forcing the demons to roll on the ground in desperation. As more of them caught fire, their movements became chaotic, and when the advancing horde rushed forward, the burning bodies created obstacles that disrupted their formation. Seizing the opportunity, he gave the order to push forward. As the soldiers advanced, he observed that the flames had caused a gap to form between the enemy's front and second lines, opening a clear path for their next move. Werner immediately recognized what this meant. Pushing through right now would buy them time before the next wave hit, and enough room to pull back. He acknowledged that the plan had worked and ordered his soldiers to press the attack. At the same time, he reflected on the limitations of the strategy. Ideally, he would have repeated this tactic continuously, but their supply of materials was far too limited. The perfume oil used to create the incendiaries was expensive and scarce. He had been surprised to learn that such oils even existed in this world, but they were treated as luxury items with very little availability. The only reason they had managed to gather so much so quickly was their proximity to the capital and his father's standing as Minister of Ceremonies. Werner had used his father's name directly to buy up the supply. Even so, he accepted that it was still better than facing death without any means of resistance. Without wasting time, he gave the order for a second volley, while wondering how long they could maintain this advantage. Meanwhile, Maisel and his group continued their battle against the demon. As they fought, one of his companions urged him to separate the targets, and he quickly agreed. He had noticed something during the fight. Whenever they hit the one on the left, that section healed up first, while the rest of the body lagged behind in recovery. Anna confirmed the observation, and Lugenz quickly understood the implication. The way they were positioned, it looked like the outer figures were shielding the one in the center. They had been targeting the humanoid one without knowing which was the true main body, but even if it was not, it was almost certainly the one keeping the others alive. Agreeing on this, they decided to concentrate their attacks on that specific target first. Maisel laid it out. He would keep up his attacks on the center, same as before, drawing fire from both sides. That was the moment for Lugenz and Anna to get into position and hit the leftmost one with everything they had. The mage hesitated, concerned about leaving him exposed, but he reassured her that it would be fine. He trusted their speed, they could do it. And if his reads on the situation was right, the central demon would start to waver the moment the left one went down, leaving him an opening to finish it. If things turned ugly, he told Rick to throw him a potion. With that, the group prepared to execute the plan. They confirmed their roles, and although there was some concern, they committed to the strategy. As they moved into action, Maisel charged forward again. The demon mocked their approach, calling it a repetitive tactic, but as the plan unfolded, the supporting entities were cut down. With their defenses broken, the main body was left vulnerable. Enraged, the demon lashed out, but Maisel seized the opening and struck decisively, bringing it down. As the battle ended, his companions cheered. One of them spotted something nearby, a treasure chest, and a massive one at that. Before they could celebrate fully, the demon spoke again, its voice filled with amusement. It remarked that it liked the look on Maisel's face and began imagining his despair. It claimed that by now, its forces would have already wiped out the knights, and that when he returned, he would find nothing but a field of corpses. Hearing this, he grabbed hold of the demon and demanded an explanation. The creature only laughed, saying that his expression was perfect for what was to come. It spoke of an awakening and continued laughing as its presence faded. Despite the unsettling words, Lugenz declared that they had done it. The demon was down. While looking at the treasure chest and remarking on its size, Lugens pointed out that they could probably extract more from the fallen enemies too.